Week 12 of the fantasy football season, and his wide receiver starts as hits of every matchup this week. The first one, Buffalo Bills at the Lions on Thanksgiving Day. So Stephon Diggs, I know last week was in a great game for him, and he didn't get targeted in the first quarter, but right here, finished up with the end zone, finished up with a touchdown. He had 15 fantasy points, and this week here versus a Lion defense that don't stop anybody. You start him, and even Gabe Davis you're going to start. Gabe Davis, we know he's a hit-or-miss type of wide receiver, but when he hits, he puts up big fantasy points. And over the last couple weeks here in PPR leagues, he at least has 32 fantasy points in the last two ball games. So Gabe Davis, I'll give the nod to this week, and Isaiah McKenzie, just too inconsistent. A guy not doing much each and every week. Some weeks he'll find the end zone, and that's about it. But this week here with no teams on bye, he's a sit this week. Now to the Lions, Amon St. Brown. He's been getting things going over the last couple weeks here. After an ankle injury and a concussion, set him back a little bit. But this week here in a game where they're going to be chasing points, and the Lions are going to have to throw a ton, in my opinion, here. He's going to get a lot of work, and he's a guy that could have another decent game, even versus a good defense. And he's a start this week. Khalif Raymond and DJ Chark, they're just background guys. Guys are going to be inconsistent, not really put up numbers. And DJ Chark, I know he came back last week, but once again, he had a goose egg. He's a sit. And Khalif Raymond, only in the deepest of leagues, he's a guy you can maybe obviously roster on your team, but he's a sit either way. Now to the Giants at the Dallas Cowboys, second game on Thanksgiving. Darius Slayton, the number one target for Daniel Jones and the Giant team. And now with Wendell Robinson out for the season with a torn ACL, more targets are going to come his way. He had 10 in the last ball game, and he's been an explosive wide receiver, making some big plays for this Giant team. So this Giant offense, we know, isn't all that great. Besides Saquon Barkley, and Daniel Jones is just doing enough for them to win some ball games. But in this one here, if they're going to want to beat this Cowboy team, they're going to have to put points on the board, and they're going to get the receivers involved. So Slayton, I have as a start in 12-team leagues or deeper this week here, in 3 receivers or flex option. Now Kenny Golladay, Richie James Jr., these guys pretty much haven't done anything at all this season here, especially Golladay. He's been a walking injury. He's been out of the lineup, and he's a guy you can't trust or even own on your roster. He's a sit. And Richie James, I know, found the end zone last week, but he's a guy you really can't trust, and he's a sit as well. And out of the Cowboys, CeeDee Lamb, you have him as a start each and every week. Some weeks you're going to have monster games like we saw a few weeks ago versus Green Bay, and then last week in Minnesota where they didn't need him to have that monster game. He only had 7 fantasy points, but this week here versus the Giants, he's a starter. Michael Gallup, he just hasn't been fantasy worthy this season here. He's a guy getting 40, 50 yards at most, not finding the end zone, and they're not targeting him as much, so he's an easy sit this week. Now to the Patriots at the Vikings to close out the Thanksgiving slate. Right here, Jacoby Myers. He's been a solid wide receiver this season here for fantasy owners, and a Mac Jones favorite. So this week here, as a number 2 wide receiver or flex option, I got Myers as a start. He's a guy that could finish in the top 20 possibly in fantasy points at the position this week here. And this Vikings secondary ain't all that great. We saw them get torched up last week by the Dallas Cowboys. So right here, I think Myers is a decent start. Devontae Parker, it's been a couple decent games for him over here in New England, but he's not going to do much, and he's a sit. Justin Jefferson coming off a bad game last week with only 6.30 fantasy points in PPR leagues. I think he's going to have a monster ball game even versus a good New England defense, and this is what we've seen from Jefferson. Usually when he's come off a bad ball game, he comes out with a monster one. So this week here, in another home game for Minnesota, after they got the doors blown off last week, I think they're going to try to get off to a quick start, and Justin Jefferson's going to be a guy you got to feed early and often to get the tone set, and I think they will in this one. Adam Thielen this season, he's definitely taken a step back in terms of fantasy football. And right now, I can't trust him. Patriots defense playing good, and Adam Thielen, he's only had double-digit fantasy games, only 4 times this season. So right here, he's a sit for me. We got to see more from him. And like I mentioned, all the teams are playing this week here, so he's a guy you're not really going to consider only in the deepest of leagues as a start. Now to the Denver Broncos at the Carolina Panthers. Courtland Sutton, he's been playing some decent football, and the only bright spot pretty much on this offense over here, him and Latavius Murray for this Bronco team. So this week here versus a Carolina team that can't stop anyone pretty much through the air. We even saw Demarcus Robinson just go for 128 yards. I got Sutton on his start, even with a struggling Obviously, Russell Wilson, Jerry Jeudy, we don't know if he's going to play in this ball game. He's a guy that's been a bust, no doubt about it, this season with injuries and him and Russell Wilson not being on the same page. So even if he plays in this one, he's a sit. And out to the Panthers, I know Sam Darnold's back in the lineup, and him and DJ Moore had a great rapport last season, but DJ Moore's been too risky. Every team is playing this week, like I mentioned here. And he's a guy, obviously you're not going to drop off your roster. You're going to stash him on your bench and see what he does. But right here, he's a sit. And Terrace Marshall, we saw a couple decent games out of him. But he's a young wide receiver, obviously, in his second season in the NFL. And he's not a guy I could trust as well in basic format. So he's a sit as well. Now to the Texans. At the Miami Dolphins, Brandon Cooks, he's pretty much going through the motions this season here. He wanted out of Houston. Nothing ever came to fruition on a trade at the deadline. And he's getting pretty much 8-10 fantasy points at most in PPR leagues. And right here versus this Miami Dolphin team coming off a bye in Miami, I can't trust Brandon Cooks. And Nico Collins, we've seen some decent games out of him, but he's another guy I can't trust as well, especially all the teams are playing this week here. He's a guy, obviously, that's going to be on your bench and a good bench guy to have on your roster if injury and when the buys start up once again next week. But right here, both Texans wide receivers are sits for me, and both Dolphin wide receivers are start. Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, what a season it's been, and what a duo these guys have been here for this Miami Dolphin team. Possibly the best duo at wide receiver in all the NFL this season. Tua's getting them the ball, big yard after catch guys, and this week here versus a weak Houston team, they're both going to have monster games, I think, here. And then must starts now to the Cincinnati Bengals. At the Titans, Jamar Chase, there's a possibility he could play in this ball game. And obviously he does. He's a guy you're going out there and start, even coming off a bad injury. It's Jamar Chase, I'm starting him. And T. Higgins, I'm starting as well. Last week, a big ball game for T. Higgins with over 20 fantasy points in that one. And him and Joe Burrow, they just keep building on the rapport. If Chase is back in this game, more defense of coverage is going to roll his way, and it opens things up for Higgins. So this week he's a start. Tyler Boyd last week, one of the down ball games for him in a while, and this week he's a borderline option. Obviously, if Jamar Chase is not going to play in this game, though, I'm going to bump up Tyler Boyd to a start, but I'm thinking Chase is going to play. He's off crutches. He's got a chance to practice this week here. And Tyler Boyd last week, like I mentioned, he didn't do much. So right now, he's a borderline option. Now to the Titans side of things, Traylon Burks is at the flex option or number 3 wide receiver in 3 receiver leagues I have as a start this week. Last week, he only played about 50% of the snaps, and he still had 111 receiving yards on 7 catches. So this guy's a great talent. They traded A.J. Brown away because they knew they couldn't pay him, but they got Burks as the replacement. And this guy's a physical wide receiver. He could blow by secondaries. We saw last week him make a few good plays on a good corner on Jair Alexander of the Green Bay Packers. So right here, I think Burks is the real deal. He's up to snuff with the playbook. He's off an injury. And I would start him this week because the other guys mentioned here, Robert Woods and Westbrook-Ikhine, really haven't done much all season except that one blow-up game for Westbrook-Ikhine for this Titan team a few weeks ago versus the Jaguars. But besides that, they haven't done much, these wide receivers. And Traylon Burks, he's going to be a guy I think Tannehill's going to target, and a guy's got big play ability. So I got him as a start. Now to the Bears at the New York Jets. So right here, Darnell Mooney's a borderline option. 1 week he'll have a great game, and then another week he really won't do anything. So right here, like I said, a lot of options this week with every team playing. He's borderline. And on to Chase Claypool. They traded for him at the trade deadline, but he's done nothing for this team. 2 or 3 fantasy points pretty much is what Claypool's been getting. He's a guy recommended to drop early in the week here, and there's no way I got confidence in playing him, even if you kept him on your roster. So he's a sit. And now to the Jets, their wide receivers pretty much haven't done anything except Garrett Wilson, 2 good ball games with Zach Wilson. And right now, we don't know for sure if Zach Wilson's going to remain the starter, but right here in this one, I am benching all Jet wide receivers. Zach Wilson's not getting the job done. Last week, only 77 pass yards, and he's pretty much maxing out at 130, 150 a game he's been averaging is Zach Wilson, and that's not a good sign for these wide receivers, even in a decent matchup versus the Bears. I got him as sits. Now to the Falcons at the Commanders, and right here, Marcus Mariota, he don't really target the wide receivers that much. I know Drake London had a touchdown last week, but he only had 1 catch for 2 yards and a touchdown. So right now, Drake London, I thought he was going to be one of the best rookie wide receivers this season. That really hasn't happened First few weeks, he was off to a hot start, and then he fizzled out quickly. And this week here versus a Commander defense that's been playing pretty decent over the last few weeks here. I got Drake London as a sit. He's just not getting enough volume or targets to trust him, especially in a week where every team is playing. Out to the Commanders, Terry McLaurin and Curtis Samuel. A great matchup here versus a weak Falcons secondary that's top 10 and giving up fantasy points to wide receivers. And both these guys have been finding the end zone and putting up numbers for the most part since Taylor Heineke's been inserted into the starting lineup, and he's going to be the starter now for the remainder of the season. So this week there starts in Jahan Dotson. We know he's a talented rookie. We saw some good ball games out of him early in the season, but the last 2 weeks since he returned from injury, him and Taylor Heineke really haven't had a rapport, and he's a sit this week now to the Buccaneers at the Browns. Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, they're wide receivers. I know they're not having the greatest of seasons, but these are guys you can't bench. These are guys that could break off and have a big ball game any week, and this could be the week here. Browns' defense is weak in the secondary, even though Denzel Ward, we know, has been a good corner in his career. And coming off a bye week here, I think things are going to get right for this Buc team. They had a nice game in Germany with the victory. They beat the Rams in the closing seconds a few weeks ago as well in Week 9 here. And I think Godwin and Evans, with the rest and their nagging injuries here, come out with a good ball game with the dog pound. So they both starts. And Julio Jones, he'll probably play in this ball game, but he's a guy you can't count on. He's been injured over the last few seasons on and off. I know he had a touchdown a few weeks ago for this Buc team, but too many options at wide receiver this week, so he's a sit. Amari Cooper and Donovan Peoples-Jones, a great 1-2 tandem this season here for this Brown team. And now in Week 13, when Deshaun Watson comes back, it could be sky the limit for these guys. But these guys playing good football with Jacoby Brissett. Donovan Peoples-Jones, double-digit fantasy points the last 4 weeks in a row. And right here in PPR, I think he could do it again. And Amari Cooper, what a resurgence as well for him with this Brown team. So they both starts for me this week. Now to the Ravens. At the Jaguars, Devin Duvernay, he pretty much hasn't done anything over the last few weeks, getting 2 or 3 fantasy points weekly, so he's a sit. Demarcus Robinson, I know he's coming off that big pop game for 9 catches, 128 yards, but I got to see another great game out of him, 1 more week at least, to put him in the conversation. I know he could be operating as the number 1 guy over there, and no doubt about it, Lamar has faith in Demarcus Robinson from what we've seen from him over the last 2 out of 3 weeks. But this week here, 1 more week, I got to see it out of him before I put him in the lineup, so he's a sit. And out to the Jaguars, it's pretty straightforward. Christian Kirk has had a great year in his first year in Jacksonville. I know he's had a couple down weeks here and there, but you start him this week because this could be a ball game where the Jaguars are chasing points, and he's a solid number 2 wide receiver is Christian Kirk for your team. Marvin Jones and Zay Jones, it's been a couple good weeks, and then weeks where they disappear on end. So this week here, both Jones guys are sits for me. Trevor Lawrence, pretty much, he's targeting Christian Kirk. ETN is the top 2 guys out of the backfield. Then Evan Ingram getting some decent work as well at tight end. But right here, Marvin and Zay Jones this week versus a Raven defense that's straightened their act out over the last few weeks here. I have his sits now to the Los Angeles Chargers at the Arizona Cardinals. So right here, Keenan Allen, he came back and he looked pretty good in that one with 94 yards receiving. So this week here, it looks like the limitations are off. He's a start versus this weak secondary over there in Arizona. We just saw Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk carve him up on Monday Night Football, so he's a start. And Mike Williams, we know he left the game with his injury once again, the high ankle sprain re-aggravating it. So if he plays Mike Williams, he's a start for me. And Joshua Palmer is a borderline option either way for me. I know he had a touchdown and a long ball last week, but he's been a guy, 1 good week, 1 bad week, just inconsistent. Palmer's been this season, though, even though he's a solid guy to have as a flex or a third receiver on bye weeks. But this week here, with all the teams back playing, he's borderline. Now to the Cardinals, DeAndre Hopkins. What am I going to say? This guy's back after coming off the suspension, playing good football, and he's a start this week. Hollywood Brown, he's designated to return. He came off IR last week. We don't know for sure if he's going to play, but obviously if he plays, he's an explosive and deep ball threat and a start. No doubt about it this week. Rondale Moore, if Brown is out as a start, even though Moore's dealing with his own issues, obviously leaving the ball game after the first snap on Monday Night Football versus the 49ers. But right here, Rondale Moore's a start for me if Brown's out. If Brown plays and Moore's hurt, obviously, he's a sit. Now to the next ball game. Vegas Raiders at the Seattle Seahawks. Davante Adams, what a great season it's been for him in Las Vegas. But besides that, this team's struggling this year, and it's been the defense that's been the problem. Josh Jacobs and Davante Adams having great years, and Adams this week once again wouldn't be surprising if he finds the end zone at least once, but possibly twice. Matt Collins, couple decent games here and there. He's operating as the number 2 wide receiver, obviously. While Hunter Renfrow out a few more weeks minimum, but he's a sit for me, is Hollins. He's been inconsistent. And like I mentioned, this Raider offense, not many bright spots this season. Now, DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, it starts for me. This Raiders secondary don't stop anyone. We've seen it over the last few weeks. And these 2 wide receivers have a great rapport with Geno Smith. So right here, it's a no-brainer for me to start both of them this week here in a plus matchup. Home as well with the 12th man. And coming off a bye week as well to get healthier, because we know Metcalf got hurt a few weeks ago. And no one thought he would ever play in the next game, but he gutted it out and he played. So right now, maybe closer to 100% is Metcalf. And he could have another plus game when he's a start. Now to the Saints at the 49ers. Chris Olave in his rookie year, he's the number 1 man over there in New Orleans, especially with Michael Thomas, who's been out since week 3. And he's obviously out for the season with the toe injury. So Chris Olave, he's a start each and every week here, no matter what. And this is a game they could be chasing points as well. Some good garbage time. Now Jarvis Landry, I'm sitting him. I know last week he found the end zone, but he's another guy. He's not 100% healthy. Him and Andy Dalton don't really have a great rapport over there in New Orleans. And he's a guy that this week I don't see fantasy owners starting, especially with all the teams back. And if you got to start him, that's a deep desperation play, in my opinion. Now to San Francisco, not much to say. Deebo Samuel, I know he was slumping a little bit for a few weeks, but last week versus the Cardinals, what a ball game he had with Deebo. Explosive plays, end-around plays, running the ball a little as well out of the backfield. Then he's a dynamic and a gadget guy that you start each and every week. And Brandon Ayuk, the last few weeks here, he's been finding the end zone. The yards haven't been all that great, but if he's finding the end zone once or twice a ball game here, he's a guy that's going to pay huge dividends. And he's a solid number 2 flex option each and every week now, especially in an offense where defenses, they're not worried about Ayuk. They've got to start with stopping Deebo Samuel and Christian McCaffrey first off, and George Kittle as well. So right here, Ayuk's under the radar, getting one-on-one coverage, and he's a guy you start every week. Now to the Rams at the Chiefs, and this Ram team, they're just in a total tailspin with injuries and struggles. Stafford's probably going to be out. John Wolford, we don't know if he's going to play in this game. And Bryce Perkins might be the starter in this one. So right here, at best, even as the number 1 option, Allen Robinson's a borderline option. It's been a bust season for the most part for him in his first year in Los Angeles. Not totally his fault, but this week, I don't know how you really trust him. See, he's borderline. And Von Jefferson is a deep ball threat and nothing pretty much for this Ram team. And this week here, if Bryce Perkins is going to be the starter, if Wolford's still out with the neck injury, I don't really see them throwing the football that much or stretching the field, and he's a sit. Now to the Chiefs side of things, Juju Smith-Schuster, if he's back off his concussion, he's a wide receiver who's getting in the zone. Him and Mahomes had a great rapport, and he's a start each and every week. Valdes-Scantling, he's an every other week type of guy. He's an inconsistent wide receiver, and I just can't trust him, so he's a sit. Kadarius Toney, a lot of people thought he was going to have that breakout game versus the Los Angeles Chargers in LA on Sunday Night Football, but obviously that didn't come to fruition. He left once again with a hamstring injury. Maybe he could be fine, maybe he won't, but this week here I'm certain Kadarius Toney. He's just a guy that can't stay healthy, and like I said, not much was going his way before he left the ball game in Week 11. Now Sky Moore, he had a decent ball game in his expanded role, but I got to see a little bit more out of Moore to have him in my starting lineup. So this week here, definitely a guy to put on your roster and pick up and see what he could do. But I'm not throwing him in the starting lineup just yet this week here, Sky Moore. Now to the Packers at the Eagles. This could be a mini shootout between these two teams here. And the Packers at this point, they got to win the majority of their ball games. Allen Lazard, he's been a solid receiver this season as the number 1 option. I got him as a start. Aaron Rodgers, he's still going to throw that football a decent amount. Allen Lazard, like I said, he's been making plays. I know last week he left some points on the board here with a drop ball in the end zone and another play he couldn't make a play on. But this week here, I got him as a start. I know this Eagle defense is playing good, But this pack of teams starting to move the football a little bit better as well. And Christian Watson, 5 touchdowns now in the last 2 ball games. And how could you sit this guy? I'm not going to say every week he's going to score 1 or 2 touchdowns, but right here, he's a big play threat. He's a guy that could go up there and get the jump ball like we saw in the last ball game. And he's a guy that could burn a secondary like we saw him do versus the Dallas Cowboys. So he's a great athlete. He's getting into his zone as Christian Watson. And he's a start this week. A number 2 wide receiver, flex, 3rd receiver each and every week. Solid the rest of the way. Now, Randall Cobb coming off a good ball game with 6 catches over 70 yards. But this week here, I don't think all these guys are going to eat over there in Green Bay and have a good ball game. So I got him as a sit. And out to the Eagles side of things, A.J. Brown and Smith. I know they've had some good games and some mediocre to poor games here. But these guys, you pretty much got to start each and every week on your roster because they could just go off anytime, anywhere. And you don't want a 30-point game on your bench. And plus, it's a pretty good matchup versus a Packers secondary that's been leaky over the last couple weeks. We saw CeeDee Lamb go over 35 points a few weeks ago versus Packers secondary, and we even saw Traylon Burks go over 100 yards in last week's game. So Brown and Smith are starts for me on Sunday Night Football. On the final game, Monday Night Football, Pittsburgh Steelers at the Indianapolis Colts. George Pickens coming into his own. Him and Kenny Pickett have a great rapport, and he's a guy that can go out there and make plays for this team. And he left more on the board last week, dropping a touchdown towards the end of the ball game. But he's a start for me on Monday Night Football. And Deontay Johnson, believe it or not, I have him as a sit. Him and Kenny Pickett just haven't been on the same page. I know he's a great possession receiver and a guy who's going to catch the football, but it just hasn't been the case this season here for Deontay Johnson. Last season, he was getting peppered with targets from Big Ben Roethlisberger, who obviously couldn't stretch the field anymore. And Kenny Pickett, he likes stretching the field, he likes running, and he takes a decent amount of sacks. So right now, they're just not on the same page here as Deontay Johnson and Pickett. And this week here, I have him as a sit. Now to the Colts side of things, Michael Pittman and Campbell, they've been playing better over the last few weeks. And obviously with Matt Ryan back in the lineup, these guys you think are going to play better. Sam Ellinger couldn't get the job done. And Paris Campbell's been a target machine, obviously, with Matt Ryan. And Michael Pittman's still a big threat in that lineup as well. I know the numbers haven't been eye-popping, and he's been a bust for the most part, being taken in the 2nd or the 3rd round of fantasy drafts. But this week here versus the Steelers in their leaky secondary, I got him as a start. And Alec Pierce, he's a guy maybe you want to stash on your roster, but I'm not putting him in the starting lineup. Targets really haven't been there, and the fantasy points haven't as well over the last few weeks. So he's a sit for me. Stats wide receiver starts a sits of every matchup week 12 of the fantasy football season.